The bar was crowded, humming with the noise of Friday night chatter and the dull thump of bass notes from the jukebox in the corner, and she had almost forgotten why she agreed to come. Claire wasn't the type to enjoy crowded spaces filled with cheap beer and louder laughter, but her co-workers had insisted after a grueling week at the office. "One drink, then I'm gone," she had told them as they filed into the dimly lit place, sliding into a booth too small for 5 people and ordering a round of bottles. She wasn't drinking much, just nursing a single glass, more concerned with blending in than losing herself in the noise. Her eyes wandered the room and then, as if fate itself demanded it, someone noticed the tattoo inked neatly on the inside of her wrist when she reached up to tuck her hair behind her ear. It wasn't flashy, just a simple design, an anchor entwined with a quote in faded script, but the moment the guy at the neighboring table spotted it, he smirked and nudged his friend. "Look at that," he whispered a little too loudly, "bet she got that on a dare." Claire stiffened. She had gotten used to people misjudging it, dismissing it as cliché, but the laughter that followed carried further than she liked. More heads turned, the small ripple of amusement growing until she felt like she was sitting under a spotlight. Someone else chimed in, "What, couldn't think of anything original? Anchors and script are like the stock tattoos for girls who want to look tough." Her co-workers shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed, but no one spoke up and Claire forced a tight smile, folding her arm across her lap to cover the ink. She wanted to tell them the truth, that it wasn't a design chosen from a wall or a half-drunken dare, but a memory etched in skin, a tribute to someone who had mattered more than anything. But she had long ago learned that explanations never silenced laughter, they only gave people more material to twist. So she said nothing, stared into her glass and waited for the noise to move on. The laughter didn't sting because they were strangers, it stung because the tattoo was a reminder of a promise, and promises carried weight heavier than ink. Claire had been 19 when she sat in that sterile chair, the smell of disinfectant and ink hanging heavy in the air. The artist had asked if she was sure, his tone casual but his eyes lingering on her trembling hands. She had nodded, barely keeping her voice steady, and told him she had never been more certain. The anchor was for stability, for the person who had taught her what it meant to stand tall in the storm. The quote was his, her brother Daniel's favorite words, scrawled in his messy handwriting across the last letter he ever sent her before he deployed. He was a Navy SEAL, strong in ways she could never be, but soft with her, his kid sister who looked up to him with every fiber of her being. When he didn't come back from that mission, when the folded flag was handed to their mother and silence took the place of his laughter, she had needed something more permanent than grief. The tattoo became that anchor, that tether. Every time she looked at it, she remembered his voice telling her to hold fast, to keep going, that storms passed if you had the courage to endure. So when strangers laughed, they weren't mocking just the tattoo, they were mocking the very thing that kept her grounded, the piece of Daniel she carried when the world felt too heavy. That was what made her grip her glass tighter, jaw clenched as the chuckles drifted toward her table. She hated that none of her co-workers stepped in, hated that she sat there swallowing her anger instead of defending it, but she also knew the truth. No one there would understand, and explanations were wasted on ears that only wanted to laugh. It might have ended there, with her silent fury and their careless amusement, if not for the group that entered a few minutes later. The door opened, letting in a rush of cold night air and a cluster of men who carried themselves differently than the crowd inside. They weren't loud or staggering drunk, weren't draped over each other with sloppy affection. They moved with quiet confidence, scanning the room with eyes that saw everything in an instant. Their haircuts, their posture, their almost understated presence gave them away before anyone needed to guess. They were military and not the fresh-faced kind. These were men who had seen things, lived through things and carried the invisible weight of both. Claire barely noticed at first, too intent on shrinking into her corner, but the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly when they walked in. Conversations lowered, people turned curious glances, but the group didn't demand attention, they simply claimed it by existing. They slid into a booth on the far side, ordered drinks and spoke quietly among themselves, though Claire caught the glint of respect in the bartender's eyes when he served them. She thought nothing of it, at least not until one of the men at the neighboring table, the same one who had mocked her tattoo, decided to push his luck. He leaned back in his chair, his voice louder now, trying to show off in front of the new arrivals. "Hey sweetheart," he called across, his tone mocking, "show them your anchor. Bet they'll get a kick out of it too." The laughter that followed was meaner this time, more pointed, and Claire froze, wishing she could disappear into the floor. Before she could react, one of the men from the far booth stood up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence filling the space before he even took a step. His hair was cut close, streaks of gray at the temples, his jaw set with a firmness that didn't need words. The others in his group looked up but didn't move, as if they knew instinctively that he didn't need backup. He crossed the bar in steady strides, each one deliberate, and came to a stop at the edge of the mocking table. The laughter died mid-breath, uncertainty flickering across faces that had been smug only moments ago. Claire's heart pounded, her eyes locked on him without meaning to, and then he did something she never could have expected. He didn't speak to the men, didn't tell them off or raise his voice. He turned instead toward her. His gaze dropped to her wrist, lingering on the tattoo she had hidden against her lap, and then, with a precision and solemnity that silenced the entire bar, he raised his hand in a salute. Not casual, not mocking, a full, respectful salute that carried the weight of years in uniform. The room went so still that Claire could hear the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. The men who had laughed stared in disbelief, unsure how to react. Her co-workers sat frozen, eyes wide. And Claire, breath caught in her throat, felt something in her chest crack open. It wasn't just a salute, it was recognition, acknowledgement, and respect for what that ink truly meant. Her hand trembled as she lowered her glass and slowly uncovered her wrist, letting the tattoo show fully under the dim light. The commander's eyes softened for the briefest moment, something unspoken passing between them, and she knew then that he understood. Somehow, without words, he knew. Maybe it was the design, maybe it was the quote, or maybe it was the way grief leaves marks deeper than ink, visible to those who have carried their own. Whatever it was, that single gesture changed everything. The men who had mocked her shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their bravado crumbling under the weight of silence. No one laughed now. Instead, eyes flicked between her and the commander, the message clear without him ever needing to speak. Respect this or stay silent. He held her gaze for a moment longer before lowering his hand, giving her the faintest nod and returning to his booth. The entire room exhaled at once, the tension breaking, but for Claire, nothing would ever feel the same again. The silence that followed the commander's salute lingered long after he returned to his booth. Claire could still feel it pressing down on her chest, not heavy in the way of ridicule but in the strange, unexpected way of being seen. Her co-workers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier awkwardness sharpened by the realization that what they had dismissed as a silly joke had just been elevated into something sacred. The men who had mocked her were suddenly very small, shrinking in the shadow of a gesture they could not possibly understand. One of them cleared his throat as though to laugh it off, but no sound came, and Claire watched with something close to satisfaction as they busied themselves with their drinks, their confidence shattered. She should have felt vindicated, but what she felt instead was an ache, a deep echo of Daniel's absence that pulsed stronger now that someone else had acknowledged it. For months, years really, her grief had existed in silence, unspoken, reduced to that patch of ink on her skin. People saw the tattoo but not the story, the meaning behind it, and she had learned to let them think whatever they wanted. But now, because of a single salute, someone had cut through the laughter and treated it with reverence. It was both comforting and overwhelming, leaving her caught between gratitude and the threat of tears. She sipped her drink, though the taste barely registered, and tried to steady her breathing. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone in carrying Daniel's memory. Her co-workers were the first to break the silence, fumbling for normal conversation. So, maybe we should order another round? One of them suggested, too brightly, clearly desperate to fill the void. Another offered a joke about the jukebox and laughter followed, nervous, forced but better than sitting in the tension. Claire played along, smiling faintly but her mind was elsewhere, her gaze drifting back to the commander's booth. He was speaking quietly with his men, his expression calm, but she couldn't shake the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her tattoo. There had been recognition there, something deeper than polite acknowledgement. She wondered if he had lost someone too, if maybe he carried his own reminders hidden beneath his uniform. Military men didn't salute lightly, it wasn't casual respect, not in a place like this. It had meant something to him as much as it meant something to her. And that thought unsettled her more than the mockery had, because it stirred a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. What would Daniel have thought of this moment? Would he have smiled at the sight of his little sister honored by someone of such stature? Or would he have grinned that lopsided grin and teased her, saying, "Guess I taught you well, huh, kiddo?" She almost laughed at the memory, but the sound stuck in her throat, leaving her staring into her glass as her vision blurred. It wasn't until she stood to leave that she realized the commander's eyes were on her again. Her co-workers had finally decided to call it a night, shuffling out with the sluggishness of people who had drunk just enough to feel it, and Claire followed, grateful for the excuse to escape. But as she passed his booth, something compelled her to glance over. His gaze met hers steadily, unwavering, and for a heartbeat she felt pinned in place. Then he gave her the faintest nod, the kind that said more than words ever could, and she returned it before slipping out into the cool night air. The wind cut sharp against her skin, but she welcomed it, needing something tangible to pull her back to herself. She didn't look back as she walked to her car, though she felt the weight of the moment lingering long after the bar's neon lights faded in her rearview mirror. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing the outline of her tattoo with her fingertip, the memory of the salute replaying again and again. It was just a gesture, she told herself, nothing more. And yet it had shaken her in ways she couldn't explain, as though a door she had locked years ago had been cracked open by a stranger who somehow held the key. Days passed and she tried to push the memory aside, throwing herself back into the routine of work and deadlines. But the truth was, she carried the moment with her everywhere, tucked beneath the surface of her thoughts like a stone she couldn't stop turning over. It wasn't just about the salute, it was about being seen, about the way one small act could unravel years of silence. Her co-workers avoided mentioning it, embarrassed perhaps, or maybe just unwilling to confront their own failure to defend her. The men who had mocked her were gone from memory as quickly as they had arrived, their laughter insignificant now compared to what had followed. But the commander stayed with her. She caught herself wondering about him, about who he was, about what he had seen that made him respond the way he did. She told herself it didn't matter, that she would never see him again, and yet when Friday rolled around she found herself hesitating outside the same bar, her breath clouding in the evening air. She told herself she was there to unwind, to join her co-workers again, but deep down she knew the truth. She was hoping against reason that he might be there. When she finally stepped inside, her pulse quickened. The bar looked the same haze of cigarette smoke clinging to the air, the same hum of voices layered over the jukebox's steady rhythm. Her co-workers were already at their usual booth, waving her over, and she slid in with a practiced smile, pretending she wasn't scanning the room. She felt foolish for even looking, foolish for caring, but her heart betrayed her. Then, as if summoned by thought alone, she saw him. Not at the booth this time, but at the bar itself, sitting with a posture that somehow managed to be both relaxed and commanding. His men weren't with him tonight, just him, a glass in hand, his eyes distant. Claire swallowed hard, willing herself to focus on her co-workers' chatter, but it was no use. The memory of the salute was alive again, burning at the edges of her thoughts, and she knew she wouldn't leave without at least saying something. It took her nearly an hour to work up the courage, her palms damp, her pulse uneven. Her co-workers eventually began talking among themselves, giving her the chance to slip away unnoticed. She crossed the room on unsteady legs, each step louder in her ears than the music. When she finally reached him, she cleared her throat softly, and he turned toward her with calm, steady eyes that seemed to see through her hesitation. Up close, the lines on his face were clearer, the evidence of years carved into his skin, but his presence was no less commanding. She began, her voice faltering, I wanted to thank you for the other night. He studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod as though words were unnecessary. But Claire felt the need to explain, to bridge the silence. She lifted her wrist, showing the tattoo more openly this time, and said, It was for my brother. He was a SEAL. He didn't come back. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. For a long moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable, and she feared she had made a mistake. Then, slowly, he set his glass down and spoke for the first time, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had spoken through storms before. Then you wear it well, he said simply, and in those 4 words was all the respect, all the understanding that she had longed to hear. The simplicity of it undid her. She had expected awkward condolences, the perfunctory sympathy that people offered when they didn't know what else to say. But this wasn't pity. It wasn't empty words. It was recognition, the kind that comes only from someone who has walked the same path, carried the same loss. She felt her throat tighten, tears pricking at her eyes, and quickly looked away, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. He didn't push, didn't press her with questions, just let the silence stretch between them until she found her balance again. Finally she managed a small smile, shaky but real. Thank you, she whispered, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. For the first time since Daniel's death, Claire felt like she wasn't carrying the weight alone. The conversation between them might have ended there, a brief exchange destined to fade into memory like so many other fleeting encounters, but something about the way he lingered in silence made Claire hesitate to leave. She stood there, shifting her weight awkwardly, torn between retreating back to her co-workers and taking a step further into this strange, uncharted connection. His eyes, steady and unreadable, held her as though waiting for her to decide. Finally, she pulled out the empty stool beside him and sat down, her heart pounding at her own boldness. He didn't seem surprised, didn't shift to make space or ask why she was there. He simply accepted her presence as though it was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the hum of the bar filling the silence. Then, almost casually, he said, "What was his name?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected but because so few people had ever thought to ask. Friends, co-workers, even distant relatives. They offered condolences, spoke in generalities, but they never asked for Daniel's name as though saying it aloud might worsen her grief. But here was this man, a stranger in all ways except one, cutting through the surface with a simple question. She swallowed hard, her voice soft when she answered. Daniel. Daniel Harper. Saying it aloud was like pulling a splinter from her chest, painful but strangely freeing. The commander nodded once, slowly, as though committing the name to memory. Daniel, he repeated, and something in the way he said it, firm, respectful, almost ceremonial, made tears sting her eyes. She wanted to ask him his name in return, but the words caught in her throat. It felt almost too intimate, too fragile a balance to disturb with something so ordinary. Instead, she let the silence linger, watching as he picked up his glass and took a measured sip. There was nothing hurried about him, nothing careless. Every movement was deliberate, precise, the kind of control that only came from years of discipline. Claire found herself wondering what his story was, what losses and victories had carved those lines into his face, what ghosts he carried quietly beneath the surface. She thought of Daniel, of the way he used to laugh about his teammates, telling her they were brothers in arms but also stubborn as hell. He had painted pictures of camaraderie and chaos, of missions gone wrong and victories earned in sweat, of the unspoken bond between men who trusted each other with their lives. Looking at the commander, she wondered if he had known Daniel, if perhaps their paths had crossed in some far-off desert or ocean. It was a foolish thought, there were thousands of seals and the world was vast, but still she couldn't shake the possibility. After a moment, she found the courage to speak again. He always said, the worst part wasn't the danger, it was leaving people behind. He hated knowing that someone might not make it home. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. I think that's why I got this tattoo. It felt like a way to keep him here. Like I wasn't letting him go. She tapped her wrist gently, the ink warm against her skin. The commander studied her for a long moment, then gave another of those small, deliberate nods. You did right, he said simply, and though the words were sparse, they carried a weight that anchored her. Their conversation unfolded slowly, carefully, as though both of them knew instinctively not to rush. He didn't ask intrusive questions, didn't pry into details of her grief, but when he did speak, it was with the kind of clarity that made every word matter. She learned little pieces about him in fragments, almost accidentally. His name was Commander Hayes, though he didn't volunteer more than that. He had served for decades, longer than she had been alive, and the way he carried himself made it clear that his life had been spent in the service of something greater. But there were things he didn't say too, and Claire respected that. She sensed that he carried his own scars, losses etched so deep they didn't need to be spoken aloud. Perhaps that was why he had saluted her tattoo, because he knew what it was to hold on to something when the world tried to strip it away. The more she listened, the more she felt a strange comfort settle over her. It wasn't that he filled the space Daniel had left, no one could ever do that, but somehow in sitting beside him she felt closer to her brother than she had in years. It was as though through Hayes she could glimpse the world Daniel had lived in, the code he had honored, the brotherhood that had shaped him. Hours slipped by unnoticed, the chatter of the bar fading into background noise. Her co-workers left without her, waving briefly before stepping out into the night, but Claire barely registered it. She and Hayes sat in their quiet corner, sharing fragments of grief and memory like two soldiers exchanging rations, careful not to take too much or give too little. At one point she realized how strange it was, how unusual to open up to a stranger when she had locked away so much from people she had known for years. And yet it didn't feel strange. It felt necessary. When Hayes finally stood, signaling that it was time for him to leave, Claire felt a flicker of disappointment, a reluctant tug in her chest. But he looked at her then, his gaze steady, and said, "You did him honor. Don't ever doubt that." The words hit her harder than she expected, stirring both pride and sorrow, and she nodded, unable to speak. He gave her one final nod of farewell, then disappeared into the night, leaving her sitting at the bar with her heart heavier and lighter all at once. In the days that followed, she found herself replaying their conversation over and over, clinging to the details like lifelines. Daniel's name on Hayes's lips, the weight behind his words, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her tattoo, it all haunted her in the quiet moments. She hadn't expected to see him again, telling herself that their paths had crossed by chance, a moment of grace in a life too often marked by silence. But when Friday came around again, she found herself drawn back to the bar, unable to resist the pull of possibility. And there he was, as though fate had scripted it, sitting in the same booth with a different drink, alone this time. Their eyes met across the room, and without hesitation Claire crossed to him. This time he didn't wait for her to speak. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing to the empty seat, and she did, feeling oddly at home in his presence. Conversation flowed easier now, less halting though still careful, like two people who understood the fragility of what they were sharing. They spoke of loss, of memory, of the strange ways grief reshaped a life. She told him stories of Daniel, how he used to sneak cookies before dinner, how he would throw himself into snowdrifts just to make her laugh, how he could be both fierce and gentle in the same breath. Hayes listened intently, never interrupting, his respect evident in the way he absorbed every detail. And in return, though he shared little of his own life, he gave her something she hadn't realized she needed: space to speak Daniel's name without flinching, space to remember without shame. Weeks turned into a pattern, each Friday drawing her back to that same place, that same seat across from Hayes. Her co-workers stopped asking why she always disappeared, assuming she had found some secret of her own, and in truth she had. Those nights became sacred, a time where grief transformed into remembrance, where silence became connection. She never asked why he came, never asked what he saw in their conversations, but part of her suspected that he needed it too. Perhaps he carried ghosts he couldn't name, perhaps he found in her the same strange comfort she found in him. Whatever the reason, they never spoke of it aloud. They didn't need to. It was enough to sit across from one another, to let the tattoo rest visible on her wrist, to let Daniel's name exist in the space between them like a bridge. For the first time in years, Claire began to feel like she was healing, not because the pain was gone, but because she no longer bore it alone. And yet, beneath it all, there lingered an unspoken question, one that haunted Claire in the quiet hours after their meetings. Why her? Why had he saluted that night, when he could have just ignored the laughter like everyone else? What had he seen in her tattoo that demanded such reverence? She longed to ask, but each time the words rose to her lips, she swallowed them down, afraid of breaking the fragile bond they had built. But deep down she knew the answer mattered, not just for her but for understanding the connection that had grown between them. One night, as she traced the lines of the anchor beneath her fingertip, she promised herself that she would find the courage to ask. Because the truth was, the salute hadn't just silenced the laughter, it had changed everything, and she needed to know why. The question pressed against Claire's chest like a weight every time she sat across from Commander Hayes. It lingered in the pauses between their words, in the way his gaze sometimes drifted to her wrist before returning to her eyes, in the steady calm of his voice when he spoke of honor and memory. She had grown used to the rhythm of their Friday meetings, the quiet companionship they shared, but the longer it went on, the more the silence around that single mystery consumed her. Why had he saluted that night? What had he seen that no one else had? She told herself it didn't matter, that his reasons were his own, that she should simply be grateful for the respect he had shown. And yet, each time she traced the ink on her skin, she felt the question thrum louder, demanding an answer. One evening, after weeks of skirting the thought, she resolved that she would finally ask. But when she walked into the bar and found him already waiting, her courage faltered. He was there, sitting as always with his posture perfect, his drink barely touched, his eyes lifting to meet hers the moment she stepped through the door. She slid into her usual seat, heart racing, and for the first time since their strange companionship began, she found herself struggling to meet his gaze. He noticed, of course he did, but he said nothing, his silence patient as ever. It wasn't until the third sip of her drink that she finally blurted it out, her voice unsteady. "Why did you salute me that night?" The words hung between them like a live wire, and for a moment she feared she had ruined everything. Hayes didn't react immediately. He set his glass down carefully, his movements deliberate, as though buying time to consider his response. His eyes held hers steadily, but there was a shadow in them now, a depth that hadn't been there before. The silence stretched so long that Claire felt her courage begin to crack, but just as she was about to retreat into apology, he spoke. His voice was low, quiet, carrying the weight of something pulled from a place he rarely let anyone see. "Because I knew what it meant," he said. "Not the ink. Not the anchor. The weight behind it. That kind of mark isn't decoration. It's remembrance. And it deserves respect." Claire swallowed hard, caught between relief and a new swell of questions. She wanted to press further, to ask how he knew what he had lost, who he carried in his own silence. But the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't hardness, if anything it was the opposite. It was the look of a man holding back an ocean, offering her only the wave she could bear. She nodded slowly, accepting his answer, though part of her longed for more. Still, even in its simplicity, his explanation eased something in her. It confirmed what she had felt but never spoken, that Daniel's memory was worthy of more than laughter, that the ink on her skin was more than cliché. Hayes had seen that truth immediately, and in his salute, he had affirmed it in a way no one else ever had. After that night their conversation shifted subtly. There was a new layer beneath their words, a quiet acknowledgement that both of them carried ghosts too heavy for casual talk. Claire found herself sharing more of Daniel's story, pieces she had never voiced aloud before. She told Hayes about the day Daniel enlisted, the way their mother cried quietly in the kitchen while their father stood stiff with pride. She spoke of the phone calls that came rarely but meant everything, the way his laughter could carry through static and distance to make her feel like he was still there. And finally, in a whisper that trembled with years of unspoken pain, she told him about the knock on the door, about the officers in their crisp uniforms, about the folded flag handed into shaking hands. Hayes didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or hollow sympathy. He simply listened, his eyes never leaving hers, his silence steady as a pillar. When she finally felt quiet, drained and raw, he said only, "He was your anchor. Now you're his." The words struck her like a revelation, simple but profound, and for the first time in years she felt her grief shift, no longer a weight crushing her but a bond tethering her to something unbreakable. In return, Hayes began to open up in his own way, though his revelations were scarce and carefully chosen. He never gave names, never offered details of missions or places, but in his sparse words, Claire caught glimpses of a world she had only known through Daniel's letters. He spoke of the cost of leadership, of the burden of making decisions that sent men into danger. He spoke of silence, of the things left unsaid because no words could ever carry their weight. And once, on a night when the bar was nearly empty and the air outside was thick with summer rain, he admitted softly, "I've given that salute more times than I can count. But that night, it wasn't about duty. It was about respect. For him. For you." Claire didn't ask how he knew about Daniel, whether he had seen his name etched into some roll call or memorial. She didn't need to. The truth was in his eyes, in the way his voice carried when he spoke. And in that truth she found a strange, fragile comfort, proof that Daniel's memory lived not only with her but in the brotherhood he had served, carried forward by men like Hayes who refused to let it fade. Their bond deepened quietly, week by week, until Claire realized she looked forward to Fridays with an anticipation that startled her. It wasn't romantic, not in the way stories often painted connections between men and women. It was something deeper, something she struggled to define. Hayes wasn't a replacement for Daniel, nor was he simply a friend. He was a bridge, a living reminder of the world her brother had belonged to, a man who carried the same code, the same unshakable discipline. With him she felt less like the grieving sister left behind and more like a part of something larger, something enduring. At times she wondered if he felt the same, if he came not only for her company but for his own need to remember, to honor. Whatever the reason, she stopped questioning it. It was enough that he was there, that he saw her tattoo and treated it as sacred, that he gave her the space to carry Daniel's memory without apology. But as their connection grew, so did Claire's awareness of the gulf between their worlds. Hayes was a commander, a man whose life had been defined by service and sacrifice. His presence carried an authority that never wavered, even in the most casual moments. Claire, by contrast, was an ordinary woman, her life measured in office deadlines and quiet evenings, her courage limited to the ink on her skin and the memories she carried. At times, the contrast made her self-conscious, as though she had no right to sit across from him, to share in the space he offered. Yet Hayes never treated her as lesser. He spoke to her with the same respect he would have given any peer, never once diminishing her grief or her strength. And slowly she began to see that perhaps courage wasn't limited to the battlefield. Perhaps her act of carrying Daniel's memory, of choosing to keep living despite the weight of loss, was its own kind of bravery. Hayes seemed to believe it, and in his belief she began to believe it too. One night, as autumn crept into the air and the bar's windows fogged with the warmth inside, Hayes surprised her with a question of his own. "Do you ever visit him?" Claire blinked, caught off guard. "His grave?" she asked softly, and Hayes nodded. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "Not often. I go on anniversaries, birthdays sometimes. But it's hard. Standing there, it feels final and I don't want it to be. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. The tattoo feels like he's with me. The grave feels like he's gone. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then said, maybe it's not about where he is. Maybe it's about where you are. Sometimes we visit for them. Sometimes we visit for ourselves. The words settled over her like a blanket, comforting in their simplicity. She realized then that he was right, that the act of visiting wasn't about Daniel's presence or absence but about her own need to remember, to ground herself. She nodded slowly, whispering, maybe? Hayes said nothing more, but the look in his eyes told her he understood. That night, as she lay in bed tracing the lines of her tattoo, Claire felt the question rise again, stronger than ever. Why had he saluted her? Why had he chosen that moment, that gesture? She had his answer, simple and clear, but deep down she sensed there was more, something unspoken that he hadn't revealed. Perhaps he had known Daniel. Perhaps the brotherhood between SEALs extended further than she could imagine. Or perhaps it was simply that Hayes saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else had dared. Whatever the truth, she knew one thing with certainty. The salute had been the beginning, the moment that shifted her grief into something new, something shared. And though the question lingered, she realized now that she wasn't afraid of the answer. Because whatever it was, it had already changed everything. The weeks that followed became something of a transformation neither Amelia nor those around her could have anticipated. For her, the tattoo that once caused ridicule had turned into a kind of flag, a visible reminder that courage doesn't always come dressed in medals, uniforms, or accolades. Sometimes it came etched in ink across skin, bold and vulnerable at once. The SEAL commander's salute had crystallized that truth, but what lingered even more deeply in her was how he treated her afterward. Not as a mistake, not as a punchline, but as a person whose choice of marking her body had meaning worth respecting. That moment became the quiet heartbeat underneath everything else in her life, and as days rolled into nights and back again, she felt her shoulders straighten and her spirit no longer fold inward when eyes landed on her tattoo. She started to live with a steadier rhythm, and that change radiated outward. People noticed it at her workplace, at the gym, even among her family who once teased her lightly about that silly ink. She wasn't loud about it, but her newfound poise made its own declaration. She was done apologizing for the mark on her skin, because that mark had carried her to something far greater than she had imagined. But life has a way of testing whether newfound confidence is real or just a fleeting surge, and Amelia's test came sooner than she expected. A charity event was scheduled downtown, a fundraising gala meant to honor veterans and raise support for their families. When her colleague asked if she wanted to attend, Amelia felt the old hesitation resurface. She wasn't sure she belonged in a place that would be filled with decorated officers, war heroes, and figures from the military community. She worked in a civilian office, lived a civilian life. What claim did she have to step into that circle, even if she had brushed shoulders with one SEAL commander months earlier? The doubt gnawed at her, but something inside her pushed back harder this time. If that salute had taught her anything, it was that dignity didn't depend on who signed your paycheck or what uniform you wore. It depended on showing up, being present, and carrying yourself with honesty. So she agreed to go. The night of the event, Amelia stood in front of her mirror for longer than she expected. She wasn't dressing to impress so much as dressing to feel like herself while still honoring the occasion. She chose a simple navy blue dress that draped to her knees and a thin silver bracelet her grandmother had given her. For a moment she considered covering her tattoo with makeup, but the idea felt like a betrayal to everything she had grown into. No, she thought firmly, it stays. The ink, lines, colors, flaws and all, was part of her story, and whether anyone laughed again or not, she would not erase it. She walked into the gala with her head high, a knot of nerves in her stomach but a current of quiet power in her steps. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, the air thick with the sound of string instruments and polite conversation. Military officers in pressed dress blues mingled with civilians in tuxedos and gowns. Portraits of fallen soldiers lined one wall, candles flickering beneath them. Amelia felt her pulse quicken. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a server and found a quiet spot near the edge of the room, scanning the space more to anchor herself than to look for anyone in particular. That's when her breath caught. Across the room, speaking with a cluster of officials, stood the SEAL commander. She hadn't expected to see him here, though in hindsight it made perfect sense. His presence wasn't intimidating this time, it was grounding, almost reassuring. She didn't approach immediately, not wanting to intrude. Instead, she watched him for a while, noticing again the way he carried himself, not with boastful pride but with an ease that came only from a man who had seen enough to know how fragile strength really was. Eventually fate intervened. He turned, scanning the crowd, and their eyes met across the space. Recognition sparked instantly in his expression. He excused himself and began moving toward her. Amelia's heart raced, but she stood her ground, her glass trembling only slightly in her hand. When he reached her, his smile was small but genuine. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said, voice steady and warm. She smiled back, though her words stumbled. "I almost didn't come." His gaze shifted briefly to her arm where the tattoo lay visible, and then back to her eyes. "Glad you did. How have you been holding up since that day?" She exhaled softly, almost laughing at the understatement. "Different. Better, I think. You gave me more than you probably realize." He studied her for a moment, as though weighing how much to respond, then simply nodded. "Sometimes a single gesture is all someone needs. I didn't do much, you carried the rest." They talked more than Amelia expected. The commander shared small glimpses of his world, not classified stories or battlefield accounts, but human reflections about resilience, brotherhood, and the cost of service. Amelia, in turn, found herself sharing her own doubts and the way his salute had shifted her perspective. To her surprise, he listened with the attentiveness of someone who wasn't indulging her but truly wanted to understand. The chatter of the gala faded into background noise as they found a small corner table to sit at. Others came and went, some offering him handshakes or words of gratitude, but each time he returned his attention to her as though their conversation was the anchor of the evening. For Amelia, that meant more than she could have ever expected. At one point, a group of younger attendees, fresh cadets or perhaps ROTC members, drifted nearby. One of them noticed her tattoo and let out a small laugh, nudging his friend. The sound was faint, but Amelia caught it. Months earlier, the sting of such mockery would have left her crumbling inside. But this time, before she could react, the SEAL commander stood, straightening his posture. He raised his hand in another salute, deliberate and steady, his eyes fixed on her. The cadets froze mid-laugh, their expressions shifting instantly from amusement to shame. The room seemed to hush around them, though it was probably only her perception magnifying the silence. Amelia's chest tightened, not with humiliation, but with something fierce and soaring. The commander lowered his hand and, without words, sent a message that silenced ridicule more effectively than any scolding could. Respect, earned not by rank but by recognition of courage, had been delivered again. The rest of the night moved like a tide. Speeches were made, toasts offered, donations pledged. Amelia felt herself drawn deeper into conversations she never thought she'd have. Discussions about sacrifice, about the strange intersection of civilian life and military duty, about what it meant to carry symbols of identity in a world quick to judge. Her tattoo became not a burden but an entry point, a bridge that allowed her to connect with people who might otherwise have dismissed her. By the time the evening drew to a close, she realized she hadn't once felt out of place. She had walked in with uncertainty but was leaving with a sense of belonging. When she finally stepped out into the cool night air, the commander walked with her to the curb where cars idled. They lingered a moment, the quiet between them filled not with awkwardness but with the weight of unspoken gratitude. "Thank you," Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." He shook his head lightly. "No, thank you. Reminding people that courage comes in many forms, that's not something I could have taught anyone tonight. But you did just by showing up." Their eyes held for a heartbeat longer before he offered a parting nod and disappeared into the crowd. Amelia stood there for a moment, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, knowing she had just crossed another invisible threshold. She wasn't the same woman who once cringed when laughter followed her tattoo. She was something stronger now, someone who understood that respect, once given, could ripple outward and reshape not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. The weeks that followed the commander's salute became a cascade of unexpected events for Emily. She found herself invited to gatherings and functions she never thought she'd be part of, each one tethered somehow to the weight of that moment. The world seemed to orbit differently now, as though the tattoo etched on her skin carried not only ink but a history that demanded respect. What once was a source of ridicule, whispered about in hushed tones and suppressed chuckles, had become a quiet anthem of resilience and honor. Yet, for Emily, the transformation was more complicated than simply shifting public opinion. She carried a dual awareness, the rush of pride that came from recognition and the tremor of vulnerability that followed being thrust into the gaze of so many. The tattoo, after all, was personal, a scar dressed in art, born from loss and love intertwined. And though the commander's salute elevated it in the eyes of others, Emily could never forget the tears that had watered the ink, or the loneliness she felt when she first walked into that parlor to have it done. What others now saw as a symbol of strength, she still felt as a reminder of fragility. This duality shadowed her days, pulling her between being celebrated and being quietly haunted. The commander himself remained a figure looming larger than life in her thoughts. Captain Jonathan Hale was not a man easily dismissed from memory. His presence during that salute had been overwhelming, not because of grandeur but because of sincerity. She replayed the scene over and over, the precise way his eyes softened as they traced the tattoo, the gravity in his salute as though he were acknowledging not just her but everyone her ink stood for.